Hi, my name is Chobion, and I'm your teacher.
And my name is Martin, and I'm your student.
You're listening to Hidden by Design, a podcast about design for ordinary people, I guess.
Are you calling me ordinary?
For everyone. A podcast about design for everyone. We believe that the most pleasurable and best design is the design you don't see. That's why it's called Hidden by Design. And the kind of design that works without you noticing. Typically, if you notice that you don't notice the design, that's when you will notice that it's just a nice experience. Everything we say in the show is our own opinion and interpretation of current knowledge and how the trends are and what's happening. And it's what we understand now. We might be right, we might be wrong, but it doesn't really matter. If you think we're wrong and you want to challenge what we're talking about or what we're saying or what I'm teaching, then just write us. Because we hope to become better designers and smarter people and to use this in our everyday life. Thank you for listening. So today's episode is rather interesting because it's about the brain and how we use it in design. And so the dangerous thing about this is that this could go on for hours and hours and hours.
My brain is very small, so hopefully it won't.
So this is a great. It's great that you say so, because all brains are really small, and I think that's it's actually a great start, right? Humans believe, and specifically when we design stuff, we believe that humans are cognitive and reflective about all of our choices. And so typically a mistake a lot of designers make is that they make design work as, the user goes here and then they reflect upon what I'm showing them and then they make the right choice. And that's really bad. And I'm gonna tell you in today's show why that is. So the first quote is from Homer Simpson.
Perfect.
And so because he's perceiving the world as the brain is. And he has this quote that says, "Facts are meaningless. You could use facts to prove anything that's even remotely true." And the brain don't like that. The brain do not like the truth. So to begin with, we're going to talk about how the brain works in terms of conserving energy, because that's very important to understand actually how the brain works. Then we're talking a little bit about how memory works, then how we think, and then how we make decisions. So how we make decisions is a little bit fluffy, because basically everything else that we're going to talk about on this podcast is about how we decide things. So if I started digging into that, so I'm going to take that on an abstract level. But it's like all of them are on abstract levels because it's deep topics. So to begin with, let's just talk about the brain and how it still believes that this is a Stone Age. And in the Stone Age, our body and our mind, so the brain, it takes up 25% of all of the oxygen that we breathe in is used by the brain. And the Stone Age man would like to preserve as much energy because they might be starving tomorrow or at some point. So, and the brain is really, really an energy hog. It uses a lot of energy. If we let it, it will just, burn us out really, really fast. So the brain is trying everything in its power to conserve energy. It wants to be used as little as possible because it uses a lot of energy. So a lot of things that goes on in the brain is, to prevent it from actually being used. This is why you like looking at TV shows so much, because it uses a very little amount of energy. You don't have to reflect upon anything. You're just getting everything served. So with that out of the way, brain do not like to be used, and it does everything it can to avoid being used.
So right now, my brain is really trying hard to not be used, but I'm trying to use it very hard to learn.
Exactly. And I'll explain in a moment how that works, right? But first, let's talk about how memory works. And it doesn't. Memory does absolutely not work. The human memory is the worst memory. It's really, really bad. Or at least it doesn't work the way we thought it would work. So I would call it, we have, if we try to move it to a computer which have RAM, like random access memory, then humans have RAM, random removal access memory. So because the brain kind of removes stuff, it doesn't want to remember. So how do we actually make our brain remember? And there's three big ways that you can remember things, so you can make the brain remember. And number one is used in schools, and it's like a popular one, but it's slow, and it's repetition. So repeating things make it stick. And there's several reasons for this, and one of them is that every time we remember something or repeat something, we recreate it in our brain, and then the brain actually physically changes and creates new patterns, and then eventually it will stick. It also, and I'll explain a little bit later about how, because that's how we think. Then we have the hook. So the brain works with something called schemas. Like we put everything in things that we already know. And if we can hook it onto something that is already known, it's easier to remember, because the brain can then just say, all right, by the way, and we're just going to add it to this memory box, right? So if we can put something or hook something onto something that a person already knows, or we know already ourselves, the brain has an easier time actually remember it, because we can group it. And the brain loves groups.
Can you give an example of that, like hooking onto something else?
So an example could be, we're talking about design right now, right? So what I'm actually trying to do is using the two previous episodes as things that you now know, and then I'm going to hook this brain thing onto that. So things that you already know. Or if you talk about, sound stuff, right? How do you work with wave files and 16-bit and 32-bit? So adding a new 128-bit mode, if that was ever a thing that would happen, it would be easier for you to remember that it exists, because you hook it into something you already know.
Gotcha. Yes.
So you just add to that pile. And then there's a last one, which is also very, very popular, which is emotional memory. And so within emotional, there's positive and negative, and they work differently. So, but this is classically talked about as the carrot and the stick, right? So it can be. It's like there's a lot. The spectrum is wide, but the most popular emotional one is the carrot and the stick. So the carrot is stuff that makes you feel good, so you want to go there. And your brain really remembers that moment or that feeling of feeling good. And that's just a slap in the face. If we were here to have a conversation like this conversation, and I would slap you in the face in the middle of it, there's a high probability that you would remember what we talked about at that moment. Now, the difference between positive and negative emotions is that negative emotions will make you remember a specific thing. So that means that if you fall, if you're out on a run, or you have an accident or something happen at a specific location, when you get to that location, your brain will remember that location as being dangerous, and it will, it will do things to your brain. Like, so an example of this is when my middle kid was, I think he might have been 7 years old or 6 years old or something like that. We were bicycling to school, and he was a little bit insecure about bicycling. And then all of a sudden, at a place where you couldn't think that anyone would fall on a bicycle, he fell. And every day since that day, when we got to that spot, he would say, "Dad, hold me," because he was afraid of falling again. But it was just a pure accident.
Could your brain remember something from, I think what I'm asking here is from sound. So if you said a sentence, I'm going back to the slap example because I'm highly fixated on you slapping me now. And the sentence that you said before that slap, if you ever said that sentence again, would my brain think, oh, there's a slap coming?
It could be. It could also be, it's like, it could be the sound. It could be just, silence. Or it could be motions, right? So you will see someone who gets slapped a lot. When someone raises their arm, they will kind of duck and cover because the environment now tells them a slap is about to come or stuff like that, right? So that's how the negative emotion work. So classical, let's take computer games. In the early time, we used punishment. It's like emotionally slaps when the player couldn't complete something. They would die. They would have 3 lives, and then if they didn't, they would just be punished and start all over again. And if you look at computer games right now, they understand, like in game design, we understand that positive emotions makes people want or try different ways and approaches to get to that emotion again. So feeling good. So if you want to teach someone something, negative emotions are bad for them to remember. Positive emotions are good because it makes them strive or try different ways to get to that emotion again. So and now we're going a little bit into the how we think area. But, emotions, the hook, and repetition. 3 good ways of making us remember. Repetition is slow. The hook is effective, and emotional can be fast and effective in order to make people remember stuff. So if you want people in a presentation to remember what you're talking about, a good way of doing that is to make them laugh through the nose. So not loud ha 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 laughter, but the through the nose laughter. Because then they're emotionally still paying attention, but they're having a positive emotion. Let's move on. We have a lot to go through. So we want to split the memory into 2, like short-term memory and long-term memory, or we can do. So, or short-term memory or the working memory, right? So here's some things just to know about the short. So I'm going to go through this a little bit quick. Stress. If you're stressed or under time pressure, the working memory or the short-term memory works really bad. It's like it reduces the effectiveness of that. So when we design for people, we don't want to put stress on it unless we want them to make bad decisions. So, for example, you can see this in offers online. They will just like time limited offer only now, click now, only 2 left in stock. Please buy. It's like we add stress and then you make bad decisions. And also you won't remember what you just did in some of these situations, right? Details will always be lost in short-term memory, right? So just think about this. Remembering a phone number is relatively short. It's pretty easy to remember, but you will forget it in less than 2 seconds because it's too long and the brain memory doesn't work with details. It works with big abstract things. So remembering a specific number or something specific doesn't work. We can't, no one will remember a phone number. If you want something to work like that, there's a golden rule of 4 items it's like 4, you can only remember 4 things at a time, or 4 numbers, or 4 something. It's like it's a myth, or it's not based on thorough science, but something really shows that it's not far off, right? So the more items you put in the memory, the more. So here's the trick, right? You can add chunks. Just as we talked about in the beginning, the brain works with schemas or portions or groups of things. And you can make chunks of items. So for example, if you want to remember a phone number, you can split it up into 3 chunks of 3 numbers instead. And if each of these chunks have less than 4 numbers, it's going to go. So an easier way to remember a phone number is, instead of remembering 8 digits, you remember 3 numbers of 2, 3, and 3 digits. Yeah, that's how it is.
That was okay in this country until they decided for the dialing code at the beginning to insert an extra number. So there's now 5 in the first bit that we have to remember.
Yes. And short-term memory is just really, really horrible. Now, the reason for us making checklists is because we realize without really knowing that our short-term memory really, really sucks. So in order to remember anything, we just make checklists and then we take the load off that part of the brain. All right, so now we go a little bit on to the longer term memory. So the thing about memory is that we reconstruct things. We reconstruct, when we remember, we reconstruct the event or what we are trying to remember. And that takes a lot of energy. And, in the beginning, we talked about how the brain just really don't like using energy. So the brain would actually try to avoid remembering stuff, and you have to force it to remember. And this is why you see when people trying to dig out stuff that's deep ingrained in the brain, we uses a lot of energy, and you have to convince it to do that work for you. Please help me remember this. Then another thing that's, especially as a designer, important to understand is that it's easier to recognize than to recall. So recognizing, and this is, typically what you will do is, if you forgot something also in short-term memory, it's like you're having a conversation and you have a question. And then the conversation goes on and you actually don't really, get to ask that question. So in order to remember what the question was, you, together with everyone in the room, you backtrack what were we just talking about so that you could recognize the question, which will make you recall that. And so also when you lost your keys, you recall, where was I, what was I doing, where did I put them, and you recall things.
The example I keep sort of coming back to in my head is a new song. So you hear it for the first time, you won't remember all of the words. But each time you listen to it again, and it goes back to repetition as well, you recognize it each time, but you're not recalling it.
Yes, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. So it's just to say that we don't want people to remember out of the blue. We want, just like, it's easier to make them recognize something and then they will remember. It's like hooking on to stuff that we saw once or listened to once. And then there's just one last thing that's really, really important to understand is that we make up a lot of stuff. Of what we remember is not real. It's like the brain is absolutely brilliant at making up stuff. Actually, it's even more funny because the more sure you are of what you're saying is right and you remember right, there's a high probability that that's actually wrong or not absolutely wrong, right? Because the brain, and so this is why you will see at traffic accidents or where something tragic happened, a burglary or something like that, the police will ask people right away, what do you remember? And this is where the memory will just delete stuff. It constantly cleans up your memory and will just remove stuff. So if you just imagine that memory is like a timeline, and every time you experience something, it will just make a save at that point in time, right? So it saves the situation. And so now we have a very detailed line of every second that passes with, a new memory. What the brain does, it just randomly removes stuff. And so the longer you get from now, it will just have removed things. So when you remember yesterday that the burglar was driving a yellow car and he had blue eyes and he had black hair, the brain might have removed that it was a yellow car. And so it just makes up, based on the situation, what kind of car that was. And maybe the brain believes that blue is the color of most cars in that area, so therefore the car was blue. And it feels like a real memory, but basically the brain is just making it up. So that's why the police will ask at an unsensitive point in time, because they know that if they ask tomorrow, information will be different and will be less accurate. So that's why they appear to be insensitive. It's simply because the brain doesn't remember. It just makes up stuff.
My whole life is flashing before my eyes now, wondering whether any of it's real.
And maybe it is. And maybe it isn't. All right. So the key point about memory here is, it's like, don't rely on memory because we forget stuff randomly and we don't even know what it is that we forget and what we remember. So that was a little bit about memory. So we're going to go straight into how we think. Energy preservation, how do we think? We try not to. So the brain does everything it can not to. So in order to actually understand the brain a little bit and how it prevents itself from being used, there's two people I'm going to reference here, and that's Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman. I think I referenced him. He's a fantastic psychologist with an economic focus. So how people works with economics. And then there's Don Norman again. And so they both split the brain into two major parts. And the one is called the automatic part and the other one is reflective. However, Don Norman splits the automatic into two, the natural part of the automatic brain and the learned part of the automatic brain. So now we just say that the brain have three levels. The very low level is the natural automatic part. Then the level above that is the learned automatic part. And then we have the reflective part. And if you imagine the brain, it's like from the very end, the natural automatic part that's a lizard brain. That's the brain that's just very, very natural. That's the one who tells us you need to eat. That's the one who says you need to breathe now because you hold your breath for too long. It's the one that tells you these very, very, very deep things. Then there's a learned automatic part. That's right above the lizard brain. And it's the one, so once you learned walking, it gets stored in that automatic part. So now you can walk without thinking about it. You don't have to be reflective. But if you look at children who are just learning to walk, it's really, really difficult. If we shift that to adulthood, it's like learning to drive a car. When you're learning to drive a car, a stick car, right? You shift the gear and you have to focus on, all right, now I'm going from 1 to 2. And once you get a little bit of a better driver driving a stick, it comes natural. Like you can almost feel in the engine should it go up or down. So it's more an emotion, and that's because it gets stored in the learned automatic part. And then there's a reflective part. The reflective part is the one where you sit down, you look at something, and you reflect upon it to get to the right answer or to understand it correctly. So the reason for us being able to walk and talk at the same time is that the automatic system in general is just a very, very low energy consumption. And that's why we put stuff in there. That's why when we repeat stuff, it gets put into the learned automatic part eventually, because the brain thinks, oh, well, I don't want to use cognitive power all the time, re-understanding this every time. So we're just going to put it into automatic part. Now, the reason why I want to split the automatic part into two is that if you design for things like emergencies or fire escapes or stuff like that, what happens when you're in a high alert state is that the learned automatic part and the reflective part just shuts down immediately. It's like it's fight or flight mode, and the learned part is just partially active, but the automatic part is like the lizard brain. That's the one who really gets all of the energy at that point. So that's why, for example, if you have a tall building and a fire escape staircase, if there's a basement, you have to make a door or some indication that now you're running into the basement, because otherwise people in a burning building would just run all the way down to the basement and be trapped there, right? They can't open doors. You see fire doors will have these big handles which you push on, and then the door opens outwards. And that's because when people are panicking, they lose the ability to open and use door handles. They simply can't. So walking is in the automatic part of the brain. the learned automatic part, and talking is in the reflective part of the brain. So that's why you can walk and talk at the same time, because normally multitasking is not possible. But you can use the automatic part. So think about it this way. Whenever some input goes into your brain, it starts with the very low one, and that considers, is this a task I can solve? If it cannot, it just moves up one level in the brain and then considers, can I solve this? If not, we move one step up, further up, and say, can we solve this? And then the cognitive part of the brain reflects upon, should I solve this? Is it necessary to solve this? And it just goes back to the automatic brain and say, I don't need to solve this. You did a good job of solving this, right? So each level tried to solve the problem, and then it just pushes it down. So here's a popular way of showing this. So I'm going to give you a test.
I didn't revise.
So the test is, I'm just going to say a sentence and you tell me the answer to that. It's a small calculation. And the part of this is you have to say the first thing that pops into your mind is what you have to say.
Okay.
A ball and a bat cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
10 cents.
So this is a great example of how your brain goes like automatic brain, reflective brain. The reflective brain goes, well, I think the automatic brain did a quite good calculation of this, so I'm not going to bother. So the right answer is 5 cents.
Damn it.
But the way that the question is asked is like a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball.
Yeah,
so if the ball costs 10 cents, then the bat would cost $1.10, and then the total price would be $1.20. That's why it's 5 cents. But that's just an example of how the brain wants to avoid working.
I'm so ashamed that I got that wrong.
Why? Everyone gets that wrong. It's funny because some people, even though they know the answer, they can't figure it out because the cognitive part of the brain would just shut it down. It's like, no. It's fine. Don't use energy on this. The answer is quite good.
It was strange. I could feel myself wanting to think hard about it, but that 10 cents was just going around my head saying, it's 10 cents. It's 10 cents.
Exactly. And that's exactly how the brain works, right? So there's different ways of things that, that uses energy. And we just keep going back to this energy preservation. So if we split activities that uses energy in the brain, we have cognitive, we have visual, and we have motor skills, right? So cognitive is very expensive. That's the ball and the bat. That's why it's so easy to get people, including you and myself, to just get to a quick answer because we don't want to use cognitive load or energy, right? So there's visual. That's what you're looking at something. You will understand it or you can interpret it, and that's a bit expensive but not really expensive. And then there's motor skills. That's like using your body, moving the mouse around the screen, doing stuff physically, and that's very cheap. So whenever the body goes into some of these states, right, cognitive, visual, and motor skills, it will try to go down that ladder and say, can I handle this with my body? So as an example, you see how drunk people get into fights. and so one of the reasons why they get into fight is that they lose the ability to have a proper conversation or argue or reflect upon things. And because they're drunk, and at the same time, the brain is now tired. It's like, I don't want to do this stuff, right? So at some point, the brain just goes like, fuck it. He won't understand what I'm saying, or she won't understand what I'm saying. I'm just going to punch them instead, because that's like easier to explain with my fists than with my mouth, and it takes less energy. You will see this with children as well, like small children. If you don't understand what they say, they will hit you, or they will do stuff. They will use their hands to explain it to you instead of using the mouth. And that's because it's way more, it's cheaper. It's cheaper. And so if you want your users or it's like if you want to design something using motors, it's like making people use the motor skills is easier than making them use the visual, and the cognitive is just off the board. You never ever want to design something where you want people to have and spend cognitive processing power. I think that's it. There's so much more, and I have more information. We have something called mental and conceptual models, and that's how we learn things should be worked, and we try to put it into boxes. I'll come with a really, really quick example. Our tabs, water tabs in Denmark, turns on and off in a specific way. And then you go to Sweden, and they reverse that system. So if you imagine it's like the hot and the cold water tap and its knobs that you turn. In Denmark, both knobs will turn off when you turn counterclockwise and will turn on when you go clockwise. In Sweden, the left one will turn off when you go clockwise and the right one will go off when you turn counterclockwise. And I'm telling you, we bought a mix battery, like the one that mixes the hot and cold water. It's like we bought one in Sweden for our shower. And I can't tell you how many times I thought I was turning off the cold water, but instead,
oh no,
I was turning on the cold water. Because my conceptual or my mental model of how that worked was different because I learned how to use it. All right, so last thing here was like how we decide things, and this is where I want to get a little bit abstract. I think we're at a point right now where I can go on for hours and hours and hours about this. So I want to keep this very high level. So we all know Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? It starts at the very bottom with psychological needs: food, water, warmth, and rest. Then we go up to safety needs, which is security and safety. It's like, do I have a roof over my head? Then we have the belongingness or love needs, intimate relationships, friends, all of that stuff. Then we have esteem needs. It's like, I feel accomplished or prestige. And then at the very top, it's self-actualization, where self-improvement needs. It's like, can I live the life I want to do? And if you don't have any of the levels below, you can't go up that. So if you don't have food, water, warmth, or rest, nothing else will work. And so here's what has here's an example of the brain will start from the bottom up. It will always start to just make sure, do we have food, water, warmth, and rest? This is why when you're hungry or you're tired, your brain will start telling you, go to sleep. You don't need to listen to this, or the brain will tell you, you need something to eat. You don't need to, you don't need to think about what you eat. So this is why a diet is easy to hold in the morning. When you have a lot of energy, it's like everything is there, and the brain has plenty of energy and is not thinking of energy preservation as much as it's doing in the evening when you had a full day of working and your brain is tired and it just needs rest and energy. So what it will do is it will say, how can I get the most energy the fastest and get to rest? It's by watching TV, eating candy, chocolate preferably, and sleeping. So you will see a lot of people will go sit on the couch, eat a lot of high energy foods while watching TV because it's low cognitive load, and then fall asleep. And that's because your brain is tired and it just goes to the bottom of that pyramid and it just doesn't care about anything else. But as soon as you get, it's like the safety, you're full, you are well rested, you can start actually having relationships and talking to your friends and all of those things, and go on and be reflective about it. So the brain starts from the bottom up. If some of the lower levels are not satisfied, it will go down one level and just say, we need this in place before we can do anything else. At a high level, yet also, emotions and feelings are key to how we react to things, right? Fear, happiness or excitement, or all of these things are drivers for our actions. If you almost get hit by a car, you will go all the way down to the very low level of survival, and you will go to the low level of the brain, and it will just react immediately on that notion of fear. I'm going to get hit by a car. But also we seek out positive emotions, so positive feedback, and we will try to get there. So, a child will try to get their parents' approvals, and that, they will do a lot of different things to get that, because when they get it, it gives them a nice feeling. So they will seek out that emotion of approval. And so most of the times, these are not big emotions, it's micro emotions. It's like anxiety for not completing on time, or but it's so little you can't feel that emotion.
So have my questions been good today?
Yes.
That's me seeking approval. I needed that boost.
Yes. Exactly. And so so your action of asking that question was based on an emotion of you needing approval, that you were doing good. All right, I'm gonna end up with that one last thing, right? So there's something called biases, right? So now we have the Maslow's pyramid of need helps us decide stuff or dictates how the brain decides. We have emotions and feelings, and then we have something called biases. And biases, turn a little bit into conventions or how things are known. It's like how we learn things were, right? I tried to look it up in the dictionary because biases have a lot of different meanings depending on. So I think the one that works best for the design is the cause to feel or show inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something. So bias means that I understand the world in a specific way, and that means that this is the right way to understand the world. And you can't really convince me otherwise. So there's something called binary bias. And that means that you put the world into black or white. So if you support a football team, the other ones are bad and yours is good. And you can't really, there's no real reason for it. It's just, you support that team. And for some people that can turn into hatred and just go very far on the binary bias, right? So it's either or. Political parties is the same. You see, it's are you socialist or are you liberal? And no one really is either or. And so it's a silly thing, but in the media it turns into, because the media really like that binary bias because they can get people to really listen to it. Then there's confirmation bias. We all should know this, is that when you understand that nuclear power is good, right? You will seek out information that confirms that belief. And anything that does not confirm that belief, you will take it. It's like your brain would just say it's not true, because it takes a lot of cognitive power to reconsider your value. And so this is the concept of biases. There's a lot of biases you have to be aware of as a designer, but it kind of influences your decision and influences your users' decisions. I think this is it for this episode. And then next time we're going to talk about conventions. So thank you for listening, Martin.
Thank you as well. It's been a pleasure.
So we had some feedback on our episodes, and I guess we need a proper outro where we say thank you for everyone listening, because it means a lot to us that someone would be listening.
And that is you seeking approval.
That is me seeking approval.